initiating central development with knightly influence, preparing for flexible pawn advancements and an agile response to black's strategy. Mirroring the knight's development establishes symmetry, creating a balanced, yet potentially tense, midfield setup where piece activity will dictate future pawn advances. Establishing central influence, white immediately contests the d5 square and prepares to support a potential d4 push. Establishing a solid pawn center and preparing for development, this move prioritizes piece mobility. Initiating a flexible pawn structure, preparing to fianchetto the queen's bishop for active influence. Developing the queen's bishop to influence the long diagonal offers a flexible response to white's fianchetto setup. Developing the king's bishop opens diagonals for future pressure and prepares castling, solidifying the queenside pawn structure simultaneously. Developing the bishop to b7 reinforces the queenside pawn structure and prepares for queenside castling while eyeing the long diagonal. Developing the bishop to its long diagonal immediately prepares castling while eyeing the queenside. Asserting central control now, black challenges white's queenside ambitions with this pawn thrust. Securing the monarch initiates a strategic dance, preparing for central engagement while safeguarding the king's safety. Developing the bishop to its most natural square, preparing to castle and solidify the kingside pawn structure. Developing the bishop to the same diagonal hints at potential central pressure and prepares for an eventual d4 push, aiming for a more open game. Solidifying the king's safety, black completes development, preparing for central pawn thrusts and asserting influence. Developing the knight to c3 now consolidates central control and prepares for potential d4 advances, adding pressure to black's pawn chain. Striking at the center, black challenges white's pawn structure and opens lines for aggressive counterplay. Solidifying the center and preparing for d4, this move creates a robust pawn chain while aiming for queenside development. Seizing the center, black boldly disrupts white's pawn structure, aiming for active piece play and an open position. Opening the b-file creates immediate pressure, and recapturing with the pawn challenges black's central control. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies central control and prepares for potential pawn advances, subtly improving piece harmony. Shifting the queen here prepares for potential queenside expansion and reinforces the central tension, aiming to exploit black's slightly cramped position. The queen now eyes the queenside, potentially preparing for a queenside pawn push or to support a central expansion. Aimed at claiming the open d-file, this rook maneuver also supports a potential pawn push later. Shifting the knight aggressively challenges white's central structure and seeks active play. Striking at the center's heart, this exchange opens lines, but potentially weakens white's pawn structure around the king. Exchanging the bishop opens the g-file, creating potential attacking lines against the castled king. Initiating a knight fork on the queen and bishop, this move disrupts black's coordination and threatens significant material gain if not addressed precisely. Shifting the queen to this square creates a cunning trap, aiming to ensnare the knight on b5 and disrupt white's pawn structure. Reinforcing the e4 square solidifies the pawn structure and prepares for a potential kingside advance, though it slightly weakens the dark squares around the king. Sacrificing the bishop here opens the king's diagonal, inviting an attack that might be too risky. Unleashing a pawn thrust into the center, this move ignites the pawn chain and challenges black's pieces for crucial squares. The knight's retreat to a6 effectively challenges the advanced knight on b5, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and free up lines for black's pieces. Repositioning the knight to a3 is a sensible regrouping to defend against black's piece activity and prepare for further central engagement. Reactivating the knight to e5 offers a subtle central foothold, aiming to exchange pieces and simplify the position. Seeking to reroute the knight towards a more active central square, preparing for potential pawn pushes. Opening up the center with that pawn push signals an immediate intention to challenge white's central control and potentially create attacking chances. Unleashing a tactical chain reaction, This capture opens lines and forces a reassessment of central control. Liberating the knight from its passive post now frees up the queenside and targets white's weakened central pawns. Reclaiming the center, white ignites a tactical skirmish and aims to exploit black's potentially exposed king. Opening the F-file injects immediate dynamism, creating tactical possibilities and potentially exposing white's king. Opening the D-file creates dynamic possibilities and challenges black's pawn chain. Shifting the rook to F7 prepares to challenge the open file and potentially build pressure on the king's defenses. Re-establishing control over the D-file and preparing for potential pawn advances, this maneuver offers a solid positional foundation. Consolidating activity on the open F-file solidifies black's central influence and prepares for future pawn advances. This pawn push aims to wrestle for central dominance and potentially open a path for your king's safety, though it does create some structural weaknesses. Asserting central control and preparing to challenge the open file. Securing the E-file for potential breakthroughs, white aims to activate the rook and challenge black's central pawns. Shifting the bishop to F8 prepares to contest the open file and reactivate piece play. Asserting control over the open diagonal, bishop A1 seeks to disrupt black's central pawn structure and pressure queenside weaknesses. Repositioning the rook to a more active file, aiming to challenge white's queenside space. Rerouting the knight to a better square, aiming to challenge black's centralized pawn and potentially exploit the open D-file. Liberating the queen's bishop and initiating dynamic pawn play on the queenside, this pawn thrust injects immediate activity and challenges white's pawn structure. Shifting the king to a safer square, away from the open files and potential central attacks. Reinforcing the central pawn chain, this bishop aims to disrupt white's queenside space and initiate active counterplay. Focusing the queen on the kingside pawn storm adds immediate attacking potential. Capturing that pawn opens up lines, potentially creating attacking opportunities and disrupting white's coordination. Opening the D-file decisively, preparing to exploit the weak D6 square and activate the rook into black's position. Unlocking a diagonal, black invites immediate pawn exchanges and opens lines for active pieces. Targeting open files emerges as a key strategic goal now, aiming to exploit the newly liberated central path. Unlocking the D-file opens up critical attacking possibilities for your rook. Initiating a queenside pawn advance suddenly creates new attacking angles for the white queen. Unleashing a pawn storm can shatter positional harmony, but be wary of leaving your king exposed. A decisive central clash erupts as white captures a pawn, aiming to simplify and exploit the newly opened diagonal. Securing the isolated pawn's advance might overextend the queen from crucial defensive duties. Reclaiming the queenside, white's knight seeks out the crucial D5 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially initiate a kingside attack. Unleashing the queen to threaten the knight and create immediate pressure on the queenside. Recentralizing the knight creates immediate pressure on black's advanced pawns and opens lines for a potential attack. Unlocking the queenside pawn chain offers a glimmer of counterplay against white's kingly confinement. Initiating an assault on the queenside, this rook repositions to directly threaten black's pawn structure. Swapping queens here abandons any hope of exploiting white's compromised kingside pawn structure. Opening the C-file now creates immediate pressure on black's rook and forces concessions. The rook's infiltration to the first rank drastically alters the pawn structure and opens new lines for offensive action.